The pause after the final note makes the song complete. So it is with life, and so it is with Golb. He is not the thief of beauty. He is the one who allows beauty to exist at all, because without an end, there could be no meaning in the beginning. But mortals, fragile and yearning, struggled to see this. They clung to permanence. They tried to lock the flower in bloom, to stretch the note into eternity. And when the inevitable end came, as it always does, they cried out against the silence. They called it cruel. They called it devouring. They called it Golb, and so tragedy was born. Not because Golb was cruel, but because mortals could not see the gift within the shadow. Now, pause here. Pause. Notice your own breath. Inhale, a beginning. Exhale, an ending. Each breath rises, swells, and falls away, only to return again. You do not curse the end of a breath, because you know another will follow. You do not cling to the inhale, nor resist the exhale. You flow with both. What if life is the same? What if endings are simply part of a greater rhythm, the pause that makes the song whole? This is the wisdom hidden within the myth of Golb. A wisdom whispered not with words, but with silence. Somewhere, perhaps, Golb exists not as a beast, but as the vastness itself. A presence not separate from the stars or from you, but woven into the fabric of all things. To fear him is to fear the natural pause of existence. To accept him is to see beauty not only in beginnings, but also in endings. Perhaps the tragedy is not his at all, but ours, that we ever needed to invent masks, monsters, names, that we could not simply sit in silence and be at peace with the pause, and yet, perhaps even this tragedy holds meaning. For through fear, we tell stories. Through stories, we seek understanding. And through misunderstanding, we slowly, painfully, gently learn. Imagine now that you stand at the edge of a vast field. The grass sways softly in the night breeze. Fireflies drift like sparks, each flickering briefly, then vanishing into darkness. None of them are afraid of the dark that follows their glow. They simply shine, then rest. In this scene, Golb is not a devourer. He is the space in which the fireflies shine. He is the field that holds them, the darkness that allows their light to be seen at all. You, too, are a firefly. Your light burns for a while. It may flicker, it may brighten, it may dim, but it is never meaningless, for the night itself needs your glow. And when the glow fades, the field remains, infinite and calm, ready for the next light to appear. So let us soften our view of Golb. Let us release the fear, the stories of mouths and eyes and endless hunger. Let us see him instead as the eternal pause, the cradle of silence where all things return. There is nothing to fear in silence, only stillness. There is nothing to fear in endings, only completion. There is nothing to fear in Golb, for he is not against us. He is with us, in every pause between breaths, in every quiet between songs, in every sigh at the end of the day. And so, when you close your eyes tonight, do not resist him. Do not turn away. Instead, rest within the silence, as though the universe itself is holding you. But the stars above are fading, one by one, but not in cruelty. They fade so that new stars may rise, so that the night may continue its endless dance. And you too are part of that dance. A light, a song, a breath, held by silence and returning to silence again and again. And now, as this final chapter drifts to its close, let the story dissolve into quiet. You do not need to remember every word nor cling to every image. Let them pass like clouds across the moon. All that remains is the stillness, the pause, the silence that is not empty but full. Golb waits there, not as a monster, but as a presence beyond fear. And in that presence, you are safe. You are whole. You are already home. Still, fear outweighed gratitude. Stories grew darker. Some claimed that when a city burned, Golb's laughter was in the crackling flames. Others whispered that when a loved one vanished too soon, it was Golb's hand that carried them away. The shadow, once only silence, now lived in their imaginations as a devourer. And in time, mortals began to call upon guardians, warriors, and even gods to shield them from him, never realizing that they were asking to be shielded from the truth of their own impermanence. And so, Golb's tragedy deepened. For even those who could have cherished the gift hidden within his silence instead cursed him, naming him a thief. He was not their enemy, yet he became the face of everything they could not bear to accept. His presence was no longer just a cosmic silence, but an echo, alive in the hearts of mortals, shaping their stories, haunting their dreams. Night falls gently over the world. A silver hush settles across valleys and mountains alike, and mortals close their eyes, seeking rest. Yet when the body grows still, the mind wanders into landscapes no hand has built. In those fragile hours of sleep, Golb's echo often stirred, not as a figure, not as a monster, but as a dream, a shapeless presence that walked across the fragile bridge between thought and fear. Dreams are strange rivers. They carry both memory and invention, sorrow and hope, terror and delight. And it was here, within this flowing current, that Golb was most deeply felt. He was not summoned deliberately. He was simply present, woven into the shadows of the mind. Some dreamed of vast skies where stars fell one by one until only darkness remained. Others saw endless halls of doors, each one opening to reveal not life, but silence. Still others wandered dreamscapes where their loved ones faded before their eyes, speaking words that dissolved into wind. These were not curses. They were reflections, echoes of mortal awareness that nothing lasts forever. Yet in the stillness of sleep, when reason softened, the awareness became visions, haunting and strange. Was it Golb himself who breathed such dreams into their minds? Or was he only the mirror, the surface upon which their hidden truths were cast? No one could ever say. But not all dreams, shaped by his presence, were fearful. Some were quiet and beautiful. A shepherd might dream of holding the last ember of a fire, warming his hands before it vanished, and wake with a new-found gratitude for the hearth. A child might dream of a beloved toy crumbling into dust, only to wake with an even deeper joy in play. For even in shadows there was teaching. Even in silence there was wisdom. Golb's touch upon dreams was not cruelty, but clarity, reminding the dreamer of what mattered most by showing them its fragility. Still mortals rarely woke with gratitude. They woke with trembling, with unease, with the need to explain away the visions as nightmares. They whispered that Golb had entered their slumber, and their stories grew darker with each telling. Dreams that had once been lessons became omens. A star falling in sleep became a prophecy of doom. A vanishing loved one became a curse upon the family. In their fear, mortals gave Golb more shape, more presence than he had ever claimed for himself. And so the shadow deepened, not through malice, but through imagination. For what is fear, if not imagination turned against us? Even the wise were not immune. Mystics who meditated under the stars sometimes spoke of Golb as the keeper of unanswerable questions. They did not curse him, but they did not praise him either. They simply acknowledged, there are truths too large to be named, and it is Golb who carries them. Yet the ordinary folk, restless in their beds, spun darker tales, and the more they dreamed, the more the myth of Golb shifted. From silence to shadow to something monstrous, still One might ask, if mortals had never dreamed of him, would Golb have remained a whisper of silence, unknown and untouched? Or was he always destined to grow within the canvas of imagination, painted by the fears of those who longed for permanence? Pause. Dreams are fragile teachers. They show us what we fear to say aloud. And when mortals turned their gaze upon those hidden lessons, they often recoiled, misunderstanding the gift for a curse. The night was deep, and the stories of mortals had grown heavier with each passing age. What once began as a whisper of silence had, through fear and imagination, been clothed in shape, in voice, in mask. Golb, who was never a beast of flesh, became described as one. They called him devourer, destroyer, a mouth without mercy. Some saw him in fire that consumed villages, others in storms that tore ships to splinters. When disease crept through the streets, they swore it was his hand. They no longer spoke of silence or of endings as part of beginnings. They spoke instead of Golb as hunger, a being that craved their suffering. And so, in story, he wore the mask they gave him. Priests carved images of him, their hands trembling as they etched mouths upon mouths, eyes that saw too much, forms that refused the order of the world. Children grew up fearing his name. Villages lit fires to keep him away, as though a flame could banish the truth of impermanence. The myth had hardened. Golb, who was not desire, not cruelty, became feared as if he were both. The tragedy was complete. The shadow had become the monster. Yet behind the mask, the silence remained. The truth did not change. Golb was still only what he had always been. The inevitability of endings, the collapse that allows new beginnings to rise. But mortals could no longer see him this way. They had hidden the truth beneath the veil of their own fear, and yet... Is this not the way of all myths? To take the unnameable and clothe it in stories. Take silence and call it a beast. To take truth and turn it into legend so that we may speak of what terrifies us without truly facing it. Perhaps Golb never needed worship or curses. Perhaps his tragedy was simply that mortals could not bear him as he truly was, shapeless, endless, beyond story, and so they gave him a form, a terrifying form, not because he was cruel, but because they were afraid. Still in the quietest hours, a few remembered. Wanderers, poets, dreamers, those who looked not with fear, but with acceptance. They saw that even endings hold beauty. That silence is not always void, but space for new song. They did not deny the shadow, nor worship it, but bowed their heads in calm respect. They whispered, "Golb is not enemy. Golb is truth." And in that acceptance the shadow was less heavy, so the myth endures. A monster in stories, a silence in truth. A tragedy born not of cruelty, but of misunderstanding. And perhaps, as you drift into rest, you too may wonder how much of what we fear is truly out there. The stars shimmer softly tonight, as though the sky itself exhales a gentle sigh. Their light is ancient, traveling across the dark for uncountable ages before it reaches your eyes. Each one is already gone or soon to fade, yet in this moment it glows for you, calm and steady. Pause, it is in this space. The stretch of silence between breaths, the stillness between heartbeats, that the story of Golb continues, though not in form, nor in myth, but in essence. For even after the legends have been spoken, after the tales of devourer and shadow have quieted, what remains is not the mask of the monster, but the truth that lingers behind it. And that truth, if we listen carefully, is not cruel. It is not hunger. It is not despair. It is simply pause, a pause so vast, so gentle, it embraces everything. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself drifting across a still sea at night. No waves, no storm, only water stretching endlessly, reflecting the stars above. You cannot see the shore, but you are not afraid. You float, weightless, between sky and sea, between beginning and ending. This is the silence Golb carries. Not destruction, not punishment, but the infinite stillness that allows all things to exist, and then to rest. When mortals named him, when they feared him, when they dreamed his shadow into monstrous shapes, they were responding not to his essence, but to their own unease with stillness, their own resistance to pause. For to pause is to let go. To admit that the flame will fade, the song will end, the breath will cease. Yet in letting go, something beautiful is revealed, the fragility of life and the tenderness it creates. Consider a flower in spring. Its bloom is radiant, fragrant, a gift of color and sweetness. But its beauty is sharp because you know it will not last. If it bloomed forever, would you look at it with the same wonder? Would its petals move your heart if they never fell? Or think of music. A single note held too long becomes monotony, but a melody that rises, falls, and resolve, it moves you because it ends. The poets of Ooo tell of a time when entire worlds began to feel his shadow. Planets rich with life flourished, only to know that their flourishing would not be endless. Civilizations carved their names into the earth, only to feel the quiet hand of time brushing those names away. To live in such a world was to walk always with two companions, joy and sorrow. Each flower was beautiful, but carried the whisper that it would wilt. Each birth was precious, but shadowed by the knowledge of one day's goodbye. We might wonder, is this not the same truth that walks beside us in our own lives? Pause. Every smile, every embrace, every memory we hold glimmers more brightly because it will not last forever. In this way, Golb's tragedy is also our own. He is not only the silence between stars, but the silence that waits within our hearts when moments pass. And yet, to the guardians and the young worlds, this weight was unbearable. They saw him not as balance, but as a thief. They whispered that he stole their joy, that he unraveled their work, that he scattered what they sought to hold. But was it Golb who scattered these things? Or was it simply the nature of all forms to change, to fall, to dissolve? This is the sorrow of misunderstanding, to be blamed for truths you did not choose. Golb became a symbol of fear when he was only a reflection of inevitability. The old songs say that in time, creation began to weave myths around him. He was no longer just silence, he was given faces in their stories. Some painted him as a beast of chaos, his breath unraveling worlds. Others imagined him as a devourer, swallowing stars whole. In truth, Golb had no hunger, no cruelty, no desire. Yet, in their fear, they gave him these masks, and here lies the tragedy deepening still. When fear shapes perception, perception becomes reality. To them, Golb was chaos. Golb was destruction. And so even if he remained still, his stillness was read as threat. But pause and consider. Pause. Have you not felt the same in your own life? When silence from another felt like judgment? When absence seemed like rejection? When endings felt like theft? So often we paint shadows darker than they are because our hearts tremble in the unknown. Golb's silence was this kind of shadow, a silence that revealed not his cruelty, but their fear. As worlds spun and lives blossomed, Golb carried the weight of these misperceptions. Not only the weight of impermanence itself, but the sorrow of being blamed for it. He had become both the law of endings and the villain of stories, and still he remained unchanged, silent, watching, eternal. The stories changed him. Pause. Or perhaps more truthfully, the stories changed how others saw him. And perception, when woven through ages, becomes as real as stone. The guardians and the worlds they protected whispered of Golb as something more than silence, more than endings. They spoke of him as chaos itself, the unraveling of patterns, the distortion of harmony, the storm that dissolves all order. And though Golb had not lifted a hand, though he had not struck nor spoken, the weight of these whispers gave him shape. He became not just inevitability, but myth. Imagine a great bonfire, its flames dancing high, its warmth spilling outward. Now imagine the shadows cast by that fire. At first they are only gentle silhouettes, but as fear grows in those who watch, the shadows stretch, deepen, twist. The longer they are gazed upon, the darker they appear. So it was with Golb. His silence, once only reflection, became to them a growl. His stillness, once only balance, became to them a threat. And soon they told tales that he desired destruction, that he was hunger embodied, a devourer of worlds. But hunger belongs to the living. Golb was not alive in the way they were. He did not crave, nor long, nor scheme. He was silence given permanence. Yet in their fear they painted him with colours of rage. The myths grew darker with every retelling. Some said that when a city fell to ruin, it was Golb who swallowed its stones. Others claimed that when a star collapsed into itself, Golb had consumed its fire. Wars, plagues, storms, all were attributed to him. He became a vessel for every sorrow they could not understand. Perhaps you have seen this too in our world, how fear looks for a figure to blame. When something falls apart, we seek a cause, a name, a face to hold responsible. And often the chosen figure is less a truth and more a mirror of our own need for explanation. Golb became that mirror. Yet here lies the tragedy. When enough believe in chaos, chaos begins to manifest. The Guardians, fearing Golb as a force of disorder, began to strike against him, and their striking cracked the harmony of creation itself. Their fear shook the balance they sought to defend. In resisting him, they invited the very chaos they feared. It is said that when the Guardians battled the shadow, entire skies trembled, stars quaked, oceans spilled into the void, mountains rose and collapsed. Creation tore at its own fabric, and still Golb remained silent. He did not strike back, he only endured. Yet his endurance was seen as proof of his might, his stillness as proof of his malice. Is this not the cruelest fate? To be blamed for chaos you did not cause, to be feared for silence that is mistaken as hatred, to be cast as the villain in stories when you never wished to play the role at all. Golb bore this fate without protest, for he could not speak, nor explain, nor change what he was. Silence cannot declare its innocence. Shadows cannot argue their truth. And so his tragedy deepened. A being who had no voice to say, "I am not what you think I am." And yet perhaps there was truth within the myth. For though Golb did not hunger for destruction, he was still the law of impermanence. And when enough voices call impermanence chaos, does the name not cling? When enough hearts tremble before the shadow, does the shadow not seem to grow? Thus Golb became what they named him, not by choice, not by malice, but by the sorrowful alchemy of fear and story. He became chaos, or rather, he became the idea of chaos. Long before mortals knew the names of stars, before kingdoms rose or crumbled, they felt him, not as a figure in the sky, nor as a beast to be battled, but as a whisper deep within their bones. They felt Golb in the fragility of their lives, in the fading of firelight at the end of the night, in the hush after a song ended, leaving the silence louder than the melody, in the withering of a flower too brief to hold its bloom. For Golb was not just in the vastness of the cosmos, but also in the smallest sigh of impermanence. Mortals did not see him with their eyes, but they carried him in their heart. As sorrow, as fear, as the knowledge that all things would one day end. At first, this awareness was gentle, a reminder that moments are precious because they pass, that laughter is bright because it cannot last forever, That life is tender because it leans so closely toward death. But as mortals grew, as they built cities, gathered armies, and dreamed of permanence, this awareness grew heavier. They began to resist impermanence, to deny it, to curse it, and in their resistance they gave Golb's shadow a weight it had never carried before. Consider this. When you hold a handful of sand too tightly, it slips away faster. When you demand that the tide never recede, you only drown in its return. Mortals clinging to the illusion of permanence found themselves in constant conflict with the truth that Golb embodied. They prayed for eternal rains, but kings still fell. They built monuments, but stones still cracked. They loved one another with desperate hands, but still the beloved passed into silence. And so with every loss they whispered his name, sometimes with hatred, sometimes with fear, sometimes with grief. Golb was not present to hear, but the echo of their voices seemed to stretch toward him, as though sorrow itself called him closer. Legends say that when a mortal wept bitterly enough, their tears did not fall into the soil, but into Golb's silence. That every cry of anguish was like a thread, weaving mortals to the shadow they feared. Not because Golb desired their pain, but because pain was simply the most honest acknowledgement of his truth, that endings walk beside beginnings, always. Yet here lies the quiet paradox. In fearing Golb, mortals also came to understand beauty. A child laughed harder because the parent's embrace was fleeting. Lovers held each other tighter because time was fragile. A painter rushed to finish her canvas because she knew her days were numbered. Golb, though never praised, gave life its urgency. He gave meaning to the fleeting. Mortals never saw this clearly, for they clothed him only in shadows. But within their own hearts they carried a gift hidden within the curse, the reminder that every breath matters because there will not be endless breaths. Golb did not chase the stars. He did not pursue the rivers or the winds. He simply existed, and by existing he unsettled them. They wished to be eternal, and he was the reminder that eternity is not a gift for forms, but only for the formless. Thus, tension was born. The first sparks of creation glimmered, radiant yet anxious, as though they feared their own reflection in Golb's unseen gaze. Yet even in this tension, there is tenderness. For what is tragedy if not the shadow of beauty? Golb was not the villain of creation. He was the witness, the quiet one who sat at the edge of the feast, knowing the music would fade, and that silence would one day reclaim the hall. We might call him cruel, but cruelty implies choice. Golb never chose. He was simply there, bound to the law of impermanence, the echo of the void's first breath. And so, as stars burned brighter, Golb's shadow stretched longer. Creation had found its song, but within that song was already the whisper of its ending. The stars had found their glow, the rivers their flow, the winds their direction. Creation bloomed like a newborn garden, fragrant and vast. But still the shadow lingered, Golb, ever silent, ever present. And so the forces of light and order, wishing to shield their fragile sparks from impermanence, began to weave guardians. These guardians were not merely forms. They were ideas given shape, order, justice, harmony, and growth. Some were radiant like suns, their bodies forged from fire. Others were vast like oceans flowing endlessly across the realms. Some were carved of stone, steady and patient, while others sang with voices that carried across galaxies. Each one was a declaration. Each one whispered to the void, "We will endure," yet endurance, like flame, flickers when it sees the wind.
And who was the wind if not Golb?
The guardians felt his presence before they knew his name. They felt it in the quiet between their songs, in the spaces between their movements. They feared him, not because he struck them, but because he reminded them of something they could not fight, that all form bends, that all order one day collapses into stillness. Imagine being born with strength, yet knowing that strength will fail. Imagine being created to protect while sensing that nothing can be protected forever. This was the sorrow woven into the Guardians' very essence. The myths of Ooo tell us that the Guardians raised their voices against Golb. They cried out into the void, "Why must you be here? Why must we wither if we are made to shine?" But Golb did not answer. His silence was his reply, and in that silence lay a truth deeper than any words, for what answer could be given? Pause. To explain impermanence is to explain why rain falls, why leaves turn gold, why stars burn and fade. It is not cruelty. It is simply the rhythm of existence. Still the Guardians longed for permanence, as we all do, and in their longing resistance was born. We too resist endings. We tell ourselves stories that we will outlast the seasons. We build monuments, write names in stone, compose songs to echo beyond our lifetimes. These things are not wrong. They are beautiful. But they are also acts of defiance against the silence that waits. The Guardians were no different. They stood tall, radiant, immense, declaring that they would resist Golb's shadow. They placed themselves like barriers between the forces of creation and the silence of dissolution. But can a barrier truly stand against inevitability? Can hands, no matter how strong, hold back the tide? The tragedy was not yet conflict, but misunderstanding. The Guardians believed Golb to be an enemy. They did not see that he was only a mirror, only the echo of the void's first breath. They thought they must fight him, as if striking shadow could eliminate night. And so their hearts grew restless. They shone brighter, but their light carried fear. They sang louder, but their songs trembled with doubt. In their effort to guard creation, they wove the first threads of disharmony. Pause. It is a gentle irony, is it not? That in trying to escape impermanence, they brought imperfection into their own harmony. That in fearing Golb, they invited the very imbalance they resisted. Still, their defiance was not in vain, for from their effort to resist, stories were born, the stories of guardianship, of bravery, of sacrifice. And stories, though fleeting, shine brightly in the dark. But Golb remained unmoved. He was not angered, not offended, not stirred. He simply was, watching, waiting, abiding, a presence that no guardians could erase, no light could banish, the silence at the edge of every song. The cosmos had grown full with guardians and forms, with rivers and winds, with radiant suns that sang across the endless sky. Yet, even in their brightness, a shadow stretched, Golb, patient and silent, dwelling in the spaces they could not fill. Pause. It was only a matter of time before the Guardians' unease turned to defiance. The first challenge came not as war, but as a question. One Guardian of flame, vast and luminous, stood before the unseen presence of Golb and demanded, "Why must we fade?" The void gave no reply. Another Guardian, whose body was woven of starlight, lifted her voice. "We are protectors. We endure for the sake of what has been made. Why then do you linger? Why do you remind us of endings before we have even begun?" Still, Golb did not speak. His silence was not refusal nor cruelty, but truth. For to ask silence why it exists is like asking the sea why it holds depth, or asking the wind why it moves. But silence can wound those who crave answers. And so the Guardians mistook his stillness for arrogance. They believed he mocked them with his quiet. They believed he took joy in their unease. And when belief hardens into fear, fear becomes hostility. The myths say the guardians gathered, radiant like a constellation, to confront Golb together. They surrounded him, if one can surround what has no center, and hurled their defiance into the void. They wove barriers of flame, of stone, of song. They sought to banish him, to lock him outside the garden of creation. But how do you banish what exists in every shadow, in every pause, in every breath? How do you exile the inevitability that dwells within the very heart of time? Their walls crumbled, their voices faltered, their fire dimmed, and Golb remained as he always was, unchanged, eternal, silent. We must pause here, for there is something tender in this moment. Pause. It is easy to see the guardians as proud, perhaps even foolish. But were they not also like us? Do we not resist the truths we cannot change? When faced with loss, do we not cry out, asking why? Do we not build walls of denial, hoping the silence will pass us by? In their defiance, the guardians reflected the deepest part of us, our longing for permanence, our hope that love, beauty, and joy might last forever. Their failure was not weakness, it was humanity, even within beings of such cosmic shape. But tragedy lies in misunderstanding. Golb did not hate the guardians. He did not wish to undo them. His silence was not a weapon, only a mirror. Yet the guardians, unable to bear their reflection, named him their adversary. This naming changed everything. To give something a name is to fix it in the mind, to solidify it as a presence to resist. And once Golb was named the enemy, the story could only unfold in one direction, toward conflict. The poets whisper that in this moment Golb's essence deepened. Before he had been silence, now he was also burdened by the weight of how others saw him. Before he was necessity, now he was fear. And when enough beings fear a shadow, the shadow grows darker. Thus, the guardians, in trying to defeat him, gave him shape. Their defiance made him heavier, more present, more sorrowful. His tragedy deepened, for he became not only what he was born to be, but also what they believed him to be. And so, the first challenge ended not with victory, nor with loss, but with something quieter, and perhaps more tragic. A deepening rift. Creation and Golb no longer danced as partners in balance. They stood opposed, not by choice, but by perception. After the first challenge, creation did not return to its innocence. Pause. The guardians still shone, the stars still burned, the seas still whispered against their shores. Yet the air of the cosmos had changed. There was now a subtle heaviness, a shadow cast not only by Golb himself, but by the fear of him. Fear has its own gravity. Wherever the guardians walked, they carried it with them. They sang songs of protection, but their voices trembled with the awareness that their songs could not last. They built monuments of stone and flame, but even as they raised them high, they knew stone crumbles and fire fades. And Golb, silent, patient, eternal, was the reminder of these truths. He did not move to strike. He did not reach to unmake. He only abided, and by abiding his presence grew heavier in their minds. The world begins in stillness. Imagine, if you will, an endless canvas of shadow and light, a horizon without edges where no sun yet rises and no moon dares to glow. Pause. There is no wind, no breath, no movement. Only the deep hum of nothingness, soft and infinite, as though the void itself were a cradle waiting to be filled. In this vast silence, a question lingers, though there are no lips to speak it and no ears to hear. The question is simple and yet eternal. What is the shape of being? Pause. It is within this question that Golb stirs, not yet a name, not yet a form, but the echo of imbalance, the shadow side of harmony. The ancients say that before beauty is known, distortion must also exist. Before we can touch the warmth of fire, We must sense the chill of absence, and so as light prepared itself to glow, darkness gathered itself into Golb, the embodiment of contradiction, of dissonance, of the strange necessity of destruction. The silence of creation was not merely emptiness, it was possibility. Some describe it as the calm surface of a lake at dawn, when mist drapes itself in thin veils above the water, and the world seems to hold its breath. Others imagine it as a desert night, so vast and still that every star can be felt rather than seen. Within such silence, there is beauty, but also unease, for silence carries both comfort and mystery. Golb was born from that unease, not as a monster, not as a villain, but as a truth. If harmony sings, then discord hums. If creation builds, then decay follows. Was Golb not, then, simply another note in the cosmic song? Pause. We often fear what is formless because it reflects the part of us that is unshaped, the part we do not yet understand. To gaze at Golb's origin is to gaze at the void within ourselves, the corners of our soul where longing, grief, and uncertainty linger. The philosophers of Ooo whisper that Golb did not arrive with malice. Malice requires intention, and intention requires desire. Golb was beyond such things. He was less a being and more a presence, a balancing weight in the scales of reality. If the universe leaned too far toward creation, Golb brought dissolution. If it leaned too far toward joy, Golb answered with sorrow. In this way, Golb was not a choice, but a law. Pause. And yet, how tragic it is to be born not as a child of hope, but as a mirror of fear. How tragic to awaken and find yourself made not of song, but of silence. We often imagine beginnings as bursts of light, as the tender laughter of new life. But beginnings can also be heavy, hushed, and strange. For Golb, the first breath was not a gasp of wonder, but the slow unfolding of inevitability. Perhaps you too have felt this silence in your life, a moment before change where the world feels paused, suspended between what was and what will be. It may come at night when you lie awake and listen to the ticking of time. It may come in grief when loss empties the air around you. In those moments we brush against the same silence that birthed Golb. And so Golb's story does not begin with horror. It begins with recognition, for to know silence is to know him. To accept imbalance is to understand him. The silence before creation remains the most haunting lullaby of all. Pause. And as it deepened, something began to stir. A tremor, a vibration, the hint of a song that would break the stillness. This is where our story unfolds. The silence could not remain whole forever. Pause. Even stillness has a pulse, faint and hidden, like the rhythm of a heart buried deep in the earth. And so in that vast expanse of unshaped potential, a trembling began. It was not yet sound, not yet sight, but something subtler, the breath of the void itself. The ancients call this breath the first movement. It was as if the nothingness sighed, as if absence grew weary of itself. From that sigh, reality quivered, and from that quiver came the first division, what would be called presence, and what would remain absence. It was in this division that Golb's essence crystallized, not as a figure we can truly picture, for his nature was formless, not as a creature of flesh or spirit, but as the resonance of imbalance itself. His body was distortion, his voice was silence. His eyes, if he had them, were the unseen corners of space. The poets of the star temples say that when Golb first awoke, the universe itself flinched, not because he was evil, but because he was unfamiliar. Imagine a vast cathedral of sound, and then imagine a single note, so strange it seems to unravel the song. That was Golb's first breath, and yet, was it not necessary? For without unfamiliar notes there can be no harmony. Without the tension of discord there is no sweetness in resolution. Pause. The tragedy lies here. Golb was born as the reminder of endings before beginnings had even taken root. He was a whisper of loss before joy had learned to laugh. He carried the taste of ash before fire had burned. The universe, in its first fragile steps, sought beauty and order. Stars wished to be lit, rivers wished to flow, and shapes longed to find their outlines. But Golb was bound to weave through these wishes, soft yet unyielding, like a shadow that clings even to the brightest flame. Some stories say the first stars feared him, dimming their light in his presence. Others say the newborn winds carried his echoes, and that even they trembled. But perhaps these stories confuse fear with reverence. For Golb was not the destroyer in those days, not yet. He was the balance, the caution, the reminder. To stand near him was to feel the fragility of all things, to feel the truth that every petal falls, every flame flickers, every song ends. Pause. And is that not in its own way beautiful? We too breathe this truth. Every sigh we release, every blink of our eyes reminds us that moments pass. Even as we live, we dissolve. Even as we build, time unravels. Golb was only this truth given shape. But imagine what it must mean to be that truth. Not to see it, not to accept it, but to embody it. To exist only as the law of impermanence. How lonely it must have been for a being with no place in celebration, no role in beginnings except to foreshadow endings. This is why his story is tragic. He was not the architect of sorrow, but its first witness. He was not the author of loss, but its eternal shadow. And so the void's first breath became Golb's breath, a sigh that continues through eternity, woven into every fading star and every crumbling stone. We do not notice it always, but it is there. The pulse of impermanence beneath the rhythm of life. Pause. And as Golb stirred, so too did others. For where imbalance rises, creation seeks to answer. The forces of form, of growth, of life began to emerge, and they would soon meet the one who embodied their undoing. The silence had trembled, the void had breathed, and now, at last, light began to shimmer within the vastness. It was not a sudden blaze, but a tender flicker, like the glow of a candle struggling against the dark. From this fragile spark came the first stars, timid yet determined, like children opening their eyes for the very first time. They shone, and in their shining they declared, "We are." Their warmth spilled into the cold expanse, reaching out, weaving threads of form from the loom of nothingness. Planets coiled themselves into orbits. Seas dreamed of waves. Winds found their direction. Creation, in its innocence, unfolded like a flower, petal by petal, and yet every flower casts a shadow. Every star burns with the knowledge that it will one day fade. This truth had a name, though the newborn cosmos did not yet understand it. The name was Golb. Wherever light stretched, Golb's presence lingered just beyond it. Not as a predator, but as reflection. Imagine painting a canvas of brilliant color. You cannot help but notice the spaces left untouched. That untouched space was Golb's domain. To the young stars, Golb was a haunting silence. To the first rivers, his essence was the reminder that all waters dry. To the winds, he was the stillness that waits when their rush has ended. Creation and Golb were inseparable, for one could not breathe without the other. Perhaps you have felt this in your own life. The way joy carries with it the echo of fragility, the way laughter is tinged by the awareness of its fleetingness. It does not diminish the joy, rather it deepens it. For what is precious if not that which passes? The poets of Ooo spoke of this dance. They said that Golb and creation were partners in an eternal waltz. One spun light into existence, and the other reminded it of its impermanence. One painted the canvas, and the other held the quiet space that made the colors vivid. But balance is never simple. To the newborn forms of the universe, Golb was heavy, difficult, sorrowful. They could not yet see that his presence gave meaning to their brightness. To them, he was the cold that followed warmth, the silence after song, the night that arrived too soon. And so, whispers began, whispers of fear. How often do we fear what reminds us of endings? We push it away as if ignoring death could make life eternal, as if hiding shadows could make the sun burn forever. But shadows do not leave because we deny them. They remain, waiting, patient, inevitable.